few shows have left a mark on American television quite like MASH. For 11 seasons, it took audiences into the muddy tents of the fictional 4077th Mobile Army Surgical Hospital, and somehow made them laugh, cry, and think. Sometimes, all within the same episode. It debuted in 1972, just as the country was still untangling itself from Vietnam, and it used the Korean War as a mirror to say things a straightforward war drama never could have gotten away with. Underneath the wisecracks and the martini jokes was a show that was quietly furious about the cost of war, and that combination of comedy and grief is why people still watch it today. But the MASH audiences fell in love with in 1972 was not the same show that ended in 1983. Actors came and went, characters were killed off, discharged, transferred, or simply never mentioned again. And every one of those departures had a different story behind it. Some left because Hollywood was calling with bigger opportunities. Some left because the writing room stopped giving them anything interesting to do. And some left because the show had quietly become too heavy to carry anymore. This is the story of why the people who built MASH walked away from it, one by one. Before it was a television juggernaut, MASH was a novel. In 1968, a former Korean War Army surgeon named H. Richard Hornberger wrote a semi-fictionalized account of his service under the pen name Richard Hooker. The book was messy, cynical, and darkly funny, and it sold well enough to catch Hollywood's attention. Director Robert Altman turned it into a film in 1970, a movie soaked in the anti-establishment mood of the Vietnam era, starring Donald Sutherland and Elliot Gould as the two wisecracking surgeons at the center of the story. It won major awards and struck a nerve with a country already exhausted by war coverage on the nightly news. 2 years later, CBS took a gamble and turned the concept into a weekly series. Writers Larry Gelbart and Gene Reynolds built out the world further, giving it room to breathe as a television show rather than a 2-hour film. Alan Alda took over the role of Hawkeye Pierce, and almost immediately, he became the emotional and comedic backbone of the entire production. The first season nearly got the show canceled due to weak ratings, but CBS moved it to a better time slot, and from there it became one of the most watched and most respected shows on television. It broke conventions constantly, using real combat footage, refusing to rely on a laugh track during operating room scenes, and letting episodes end without a joke at all. As the show matured creatively, it also started reshaping the balance of power among its actors. And that shift is where our story really begins. If you ask longtime fans of the show which single moment hit hardest, most of them will point to the final scene of the Season 3 finale, titled Abyssinia, Henry. For nearly the entire episode, Colonel Henry Blake is celebrating his discharge orders and preparing to finally go home. Then, in the final minute, Radar walks into the operating room and delivers the news that Blake's plane went down over the sea, with no survivors. There was no music, no laugh track, nothing but stunned silence from the cast and the sound of surgical equipment. It remains one of the most talked about moments in sitcom history, and it marked the departure of McLean Stevenson, the actor who had played the bumbling, warm-hearted commanding officer since the very first episode. Stevenson's version of Henry Blake was disorganized, a little clueless, and endlessly likable, and audiences responded to him immediately, rewarding his performance with a Golden Globe. But behind the scenes, tension had been building for a while. As the show developed, more and more of the creative and emotional weight shifted toward Alan Alda's character, partly because Alda himself was becoming increasingly involved in writing and directing episodes. Stevenson began to feel like his role was shrinking into the background of a show he had helped launch. He had genuine ambitions of leading a series of his own rather than playing a supporting piece in someone else's spotlight, and by the end of Season 3, he told producers he would not be returning. Normally, a departing sitcom actor gets a soft landing. Their character gets transferred or sent home or written off with a wedding. But the writers of MASH saw an opportunity to make a much bigger statement, one that reminded viewers this was still fundamentally a story about war, where not everyone survives to go home. The backlash was immediate. CBS reportedly received an outpouring of mail, much of it praising the boldness of the choice, some of it furious that a beloved character had been killed off without warning. The show's creative team defended the decision as necessary and honest. For Stevenson personally, life after MASH did not go the way he hoped. He signed a deal with NBC and starred in a couple of sitcoms built around his own name and persona, but neither one caught on, and both were canceled quickly. In interviews later in his life, he admitted to real regret about leaving what turned out to be the role of a lifetime, acknowledging that he had underestimated just how rare and special the show truly was. He continued working in television in smaller roles until his death in 1996, and his former castmates spoke warmly of him afterward, remembering him as a genuinely kind man whose comic instincts had helped define the show's early identity. In a strange way, his abrupt and permanent departure gave MASH something it never fully had before, proof that no one and nothing was safe. If Stevenson's exit was loud and public, Wayne Rogers's was the opposite. Rogers played Trapper John McIntyre, one half of the original comedic duo that defined the show's early tone alongside Hawkeye. Their chemistry was the engine of the first 3 seasons, full of fast banter and mischief that made the war feel survivable through humor. Then, without a farewell episode or any real explanation to the audience, Trapper simply vanished from the show. The root of the issue was that Rogers had signed on expecting MASH to function as a true ensemble, with the cast sharing the spotlight fairly evenly. As the series developed, however, the writing increasingly centered on Hawkeye, especially once Alda's influence over scripts and direction grew. Rogers has said in later interviews that his frustration was not about ego, but about watching his character lose narrative purpose, reduced to reacting to whatever Hawkeye was doing rather than driving any stories of his own. Quietly, without any public dispute, he chose not to renew his contract after the 3rd season, and the producers reportedly didn't even know he was gone until shortly before season 4 began filming. Complicating matters further, Rogers had never signed a formal contract for the show. His entire arrangement had been a handshake deal, which meant that when producers considered legal action over his exit, they discovered they had no real ground to stand on. The result was a scramble behind the scenes. Writers had to explain Trapper's absence at the start of season 4 with a brief line about him being discharged while Hawkeye happened to be on leave, and the show moved on with barely a moment of closure for a character audiences had loved for 3 years. His replacement, Mike Farrell as B.J. Honeycutt, brought a different energy, steadier, more introspective, less rebellious. Many longtime fans still argue the show lost some of its early spark once Trapper was gone, though plenty of others believe the series only deepened from that point forward. As for Rogers himself, he didn't vanish from public life at all. He pivoted toward a second career as a financial investor, eventually becoming a familiar face on business television as a commentator on markets and economics. He stayed on good terms with his former castmates, and Alda in particular spoke fondly of him over the years, calling him one of the sharpest people he had ever worked with. Rogers passed away in 2015, remembered less for how he left the show than for how easily he built an entirely new life once he had. Of all the departures on this list, Gary Berghoff's might be the most quietly painful. On screen, he played Radar O'Reilly, the boyish company clerk with an uncanny sixth sense who could hear incoming helicopters before anyone else in camp. Radar carried a teddy bear, blushed easily, and somehow softened even the darkest episodes just by being present in them. Berghoff was the only actor from the original 1970 film to reprise his role for the television series, and he shaped Radar into something far more vulnerable and human than the character had been in the movie. By the show's 7th season, though, cracks were beginning to show behind that performance. Berghoff was dealing with real struggles with anxiety, made worse by the grueling production schedule and his own perfectionism about the role. He was also missing large stretches of his young daughter's early childhood because of the demands of filming, something he later admitted he deeply regretted. Co-star Mike Farrell recalled years afterward that Berghoff often felt he wasn't getting the recognition or flexibility he needed, even though the rest of the cast respected him enormously. There were also practical, contractual disagreements about pay and about reducing his workload so he could be present for his family. Producers tried to accommodate him, granting more time off in later seasons, but it wasn't enough to keep him from deciding, by season 8, that he was done. Unlike Rogers's near-silent exit, Berghoff's departure was treated with real ceremony. The two-part episode Goodbye, Radar gave the character a proper send-off, showing him returning from leave to find the camp falling apart without him, before ultimately realizing it was time to go home to his family and his community. The final image of Radar walking away and leaving his teddy bear behind on Hawkeye's bunk remains one of the most emotionally quiet moments the show ever produced. After MASH, Berghoff stepped back from the spotlight almost entirely. A short-lived spin-off called Walt *R, which imagined Radar as a rookie police officer, failed to catch on, and Berghoff largely walked away from acting altogether. He turned instead toward painting, wildlife conservation, and inventing, eventually holding several patents, including one related to fishing equipment. He has described leaving the show as a choice made for two reasons above all else: his family and burnout. Today he lives mostly out of the public eye, occasionally surfacing at conventions or in short interviews, still remembered as the kid who could hear the choppers before anyone else. Every ensemble war comedy needs a foil, and for MASH's first 5 seasons, that role belonged to Major Frank Burns, played by Larry Linville. Burns was petty, self-righteous, obsessed with rules, and hopelessly insecure, carrying on a not-so-secret affair with Major Houlihan while constantly positioning himself as morally superior to everyone around him. He was exactly the kind of character audiences loved to hate, and for years, that dynamic worked beautifully. The problem was that Frank Burns never really evolved. While the rest of the ensemble grew more layered as the show matured, Frank stayed locked in the same comedic loop season after season, his prejudices and insecurities never challenged or examined in any deeper way. Linville, an actor capable of far more range than the role allowed, began to feel the character had simply run its course. By the end of season 5, he made the decision not to renew his contract, later explaining that he felt he had taken Frank Burns as far as the character could go. It wasn't a dramatic falling out with producers. It was closer to an actor recognizing that his role no longer had anywhere left to develop. His departure ended up reshaping the show in a meaningful way. Without a cartoonish villain to lean on, the writers had more room to explore moral complexity through irony and genuine human conflict rather than slapstick. Frank's exit wasn't dramatized within the story itself. He was simply written out as having received an unexpected promotion elsewhere. Linville continued working steadily in guest roles across television and film for the rest of his career, though he never found another part with the same cultural footprint as Frank Burns. In many ways, his willingness to walk away from a role he felt had gone stale helped push MASH into the more emotionally ambitious show it became in its later seasons. Frank Burns's replacement could not have been more different. Charles Emerson Winchester III, played by David Ogden Stiers, arrived in season 6 as a cultured, arrogant, deeply private surgeon who saw himself as above the chaos of the 4077th. Where Frank had been a cartoon, Winchester was a slow burn, someone whose walls came down gradually over years rather than episodes. Stiers played him with a kind of restraint that made even his pettiest moments feel human rather than absurd, and over time, audiences came to understand that Winchester's arrogance was mostly armor. What set Stiers apart from nearly everyone else on this list is that he didn't leave early. He stayed through the very end of the series, and his final scene, teaching Chinese prisoners of war to appreciate Mozart, is often cited as one of the most quietly moving moments in the show's history. When a spin-off series was later proposed, Stiers turned down the opportunity to reprise the role, explaining that he felt Winchester's story had already been told in full and didn't need extending. After MASH, Stiers built a long career as a respected character actor and became widely known as a voice actor for animated films. In 2009, he publicly came out as gay in an interview, noting that he had kept that part of his life private for much of his career out of concern that it could limit his opportunities in an industry that was far less accepting at the time. He continued working steadily until his death in 2018 from bladder cancer, remembered by colleagues both for the depth of his performances and for the quiet courage it took him to live openly on his own terms later in life. It would be incomplete to talk about departures from MASH without acknowledging the actor who never left at all. Loretta Swit played Major Margaret Houlihan for all 11 seasons, one of only a handful of cast members present in both the pilot and the series finale. When the show began, Margaret existed mostly as a punchline, defined by a nickname referencing a gag from the original film. Swit refused to let the character stay that shallow, gradually building Margaret into a decorated, complicated, fully realized officer who openly questioned the war around her, while still doing her job with total precision. By the end of the series, she had become one of the show's most respected characters, and her staying power stood in sharp contrast to the revolving door of male leads around her. Looking back at all of these exits together, a pattern starts to emerge. Almost none of them were about scandal or conflict in the way tabloids might frame it. They were about actors reaching a point where they felt the character in front of them had stopped growing, or where the demands of the job had started outweighing what it was giving back to them personally. McLean Stevenson wanted his own spotlight. Wayne Rogers wanted his character to matter beyond reacting to some